Chapter 15. 3 Cobblers Make a Genius. Colorful fucking clouds in the morning, Xiang spat as they walked towards the imposing city on the horizon, the thick morning mists that rose from the great river making the bottom of Xiao Xingjin's robes cling damply to his legs. He frowned helplessly. Xiang's mood had grown increasingly irritable over the last few days, and by now he was back to spitting poison at the slightest provocation, or without. "Will you describe them to me?" he asked, because usually the familiar ritual would help ground the man's mood, as well as allowing himself to imagine the world beyond the reach of his remaining senses. "They are clouds. They are colorful. If you want someone to wax poetic about it, ask your precious Dao Yu. I'm done with it. If I had a lump of silver for every time some pompous Jinling Tai asshole asked me to recite poetry from this hellhole, I'd be richer than the Jin." "The sun is rising," Zijin tonelessly interceded. "The clouds sweep like Zhongshui plumes, long brushstrokes of vermilion and gold. The mist turns the hills into islands like a wet ink painting." Xiao Xingjin thanked him with a smile, trying to ignore Xu scornful scoff of contempt. "It sounds beautiful, thank you." "He is quite the poet, our Song Daojang. Perhaps we should just leave him here, like all the other unwanted exiles of the Empire, writing wistful poetry for the rest of his dead life. He'd fit right in." Xu voice was sharp and cruel, a tone of voice that scraped roughly against his most hurting memories, and he had to turn away from it, shuddering with something other than the damp cold of morning mists. "Let's not fight," he managed, felt Zijin calmly take a small step closer, his presence reassuring. "Who's fighting?" Xiang hissed, serpent-like. "It was a compliment." There was a first faint tremor of Shuanghua, just a flutter of restless agitation against his senses, though he didn't need it to guess at Zijin's rising anger. "Xiang," he said, tiredly, and he probably shouldn't let his hurt shine through, not when the man, monster, murderer, he must remember that, was like this, frenzied to bite, but his heart chafed itself sore under his ribs and he couldn't help it. "That's enough, please." The world held its breath for several long heartbeats, and he braced himself, unsure of whether to anticipate concession or a destructive explosion of utter venom. In the end, the silence remained his only reply, and he supposed he should be grateful for getting even that much. Once they started walking again, he wordlessly reached out, a question, and instantly found a familiar hand against his, an answer. Shuanghua settled on his back, soothed, as he dragged a thumb over Zijin's knuckles, feeling some of his anger dissipate. Vermilion, Zijin had described the dawn, and he almost wished he didn't remember from another lifetime, that it was just a prettier word for the color of blood. Guizhou was much the same as it had when he had last come through, all those fateful years ago. Finally picking up a trace of rumors here after searching for so long. Old ones, a cold trail, but word nonetheless of a blind cultivator in white carrying a wrapped-up sword on his back. Rumors that had spurred him on, dizzy with hope, to find his way to Yi City. And his death. Song Lan glanced at the man walking at their side through the corner of his eye, the by now choking familiar resentment of bloodthirst making his hands twitch once. Xiang seemed feral, with unkempt hair sloppily twisted into a simple knot, his face locked in a rabid sneer with teeth bared and eyes narrowed to slits. He looked as though he'd like to sink those fangs into the throat of the world, ripping and tearing, never satisfied until the universe itself had bled out at his feet. Xingjin walked in silence, a hand unconsciously held out to graze against his with every step, and it did help calm him. The crowd of the city was boisterous, even though they had chosen calmer backstreets over the busier thoroughfares, and despite the blindfold hiding so much of his expression, he looked tense and weary. "Do you need to stop and rest?" he asked, And Xingjin looked up, surprised, clearly torn from deep thoughts. "Not this part of town," Xiang hissed before Xingjin could answer, the first words he had volunteered since entering the city. "Not unless you want your worldly possessions gone by the time you wake up bruised and naked in a back alley." "Ah, no," Xingjin said weakly. "No, let's not do that. We can walk a bit further." But he did let his hand linger on their neck's grazing touch, and without any words needed, he took it to help guide Xingjin ahead to spare his overwhelmed senses, squeezing once in reassurance. His heart gave an odd little, almost alive jolt when it was squeezed back, lightly but unmistakably. They had to detour back toward the busier streets once or twice, when somewhat newer-looking buildings or dead ends blocked their path, Xu Yang glaring at the obstacles as though their very existence was an unacceptable affront. "We need to cut across the main avenue and markets to get to the better parts of town," he finally stated, somewhat managing to shape words despite the constantly half-bared teeth. "Think you can handle it, Daozhong?" "Yes," Xingjin assured, nodding once, looking determined. "It's fine, as long as we don't walk too fast." Xu Yang, unlike the two of them, seemed to at least have an inkling of what way to go, and so, despite his instinctive discomfort, Sung Lan let him take the lead, following with one hand on Xingjin's and the other ready to draw Fushue at any sign of trouble. People pressed in all around once they left the calmer streets behind, and he tried to navigate the crowd at an angle to shield Xingjin from the worst of the throng. Possibly Xu Yang's perpetual snarl did help a bit too. More than one person gave his murderous face a single look and stepped far out their way. Even so, the effort and vigilance was draining, and by the time they had finally crossed the crowded labyrinth of the marketplace and into a calmer back street beyond, Xingjin slumped a bit, looking exhausted. Turning to ask him again if he needed to rest, he was momentarily distracted and didn't notice what was happening until it was already too late. A small street urchin had darted up to them, tugging on Xu Yang's empty sleeve, a begging hand hopefully stretched out, and between 1 second and the next the child was in the gutter, slapped aside with a harsh backhand over the head. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" Xu Yang roared, raising his hand threateningly, as though to strike out again. "Do you know what happens to little rats like you, traipsing up to random strangers to beg for money? You want to end up raped and gutted in an alley? Idiot! Get out of here before I rip your ears off and feed them to you." He gave a vicious little kick at the child, who was bawling with terror, darting away before the boot could connect, and slinking off down the nearest street. "What on earth is going on?" Xingjin exclaimed, finally breaking out of his momentary shock, even as Song Lan drew Fushue in a jagged movement, itching to thrust it somewhere where Xu Yang would really feel it. "What are you doing?" Xingjin asked again, stepping forward, looking absolutely stricken. Xu Yang turned to him, and the sneer hadn't wavered for a moment, his whole posture oozing, being undiluted cruelty. "Teaching lessons. These street fleas are less than dirt under people's shoes," he scoffed, casting a contemptuous glare in the direction the child had run off. "The sooner they learn, the better." Sung Lan felt the world go dark around the edges, his own teeth baring, and the hand on Fushue quivering with the effort to hold himself back. But Xingjin looked like he would either explode into righteous anger or fold in on himself in utter distress beside him, and he knew that he needed him. With almost inhumane effort he fought the resentment down, forced it back, regained control. "If you ever harm a child again," he told Xu Yang with icy clarity, "I will cut your head off where you stand." Xu Yang just sneered at him down Fushue's length, unrepentant. Then Xingjin stepped forward, and he might imagine that the look on his face had Xu Yang's grin wavering for just a moment, going stiffer around the edges. "That was unforgivable," Xingjin said, quietly, but with his lips curled in disgusted fury. Confronted by them both, Xu Yang just hissed, face twisting into a vicious grimace more snarl than smile. "So, pat them on the head instead, then, Daozhang," Give them treats and money and tell them that the world is kind. You'll feel good about yourself all day, and no one would fault you the day they run up to the wrong stranger and get strangled for entertainment. He straightened, eyes narrowed and lips cruel, even as Xingjin hesitated. A stray, with judgment flawed enough to ask me for anything, needed the lesson. They should be grateful they're still drawing breath. He would look good writhing on Fushu's blade. The remaining hiss of resentment in Songlan's ears sang seductively. Xingjin stood quiet for a long time, face unreadable, and then he shook his head, looking utterly defeated. Let's find somewhere to rest. I need to sit down. Xu Yang's smile faded as he opened his mouth to speak, falling silent when the tip of the sword came to rest at his lips, drawing a single paper-cut line of blood across them. He gave a cold glare, but had the sense to keep his mouth closed, and so got to keep his ugly tongue for a while longer. He gave a jerky point, supposedly indicating the best direction to go from here, and disdainfully turning his back on him, Songlan gently reached out for Xingjin's hand. Thankfully, Xu Yang just followed them in expressive silence, and there were no further outbursts. Still, Songlan held a sheathed Fushu ready in hand all the way to cleaner and airier streets, Xingjin a silent, grieving presence beside him, the hand in his cold. After all this time, it still baffled him that his compassionate soulmate would act so surprised and disappointed whenever Xu Yang showed his vile true colors. Hopefully, this would be the final disclosure Xingjin needed to be able to sever those hurtful past attachments once and for all. Sometimes the rot of a putrefied wound needed to be cut clean away before true healing could begin, and Songlan felt so very, very ready to start cutting. The resident fierce corpse had dragged Xiao Xingjin along to a respectable tea house in the finer parts of town, down unfamiliar streets so far beyond the fishy, garbage stink of the docks it could be another place entirely. Another town, another world, a place not Kuizhou. Xu Yang could almost allow himself to believe that, as attentive waiters fussed with plentiful food and fragrant tea, would gladly believe it honestly for just a moment's respite. But muscle memory hadn't gone as soft as the rest of him, remained taut and coiled and ready, aching for violence all the way up to his locked jaw, a hand so tense the pain shot from once broken fingers to his elbow. He studiously picked up his teacup and emptied it, hand rock steady, not shaking or splashing a single drop, despite the effort of it making his fingers lock up in cramps. That would teach them. I have been thinking, Xiao Xingjin finally said, quiet and serious, setting his empty bowl aside after a meal shared in tense silence. Picking up his own teacup in both hands, the look on his face was so focused, so intense with resolve, it made him look like something half divine, glowing in his whites, something clean, somehow misplaced in this awful underbelly of the world. Xu Yang was vaguely aware of Songlan turning to that light too, as unable to resist it as himself. I was always taught, Xiao Xingjin continued, that to live with true purpose, to follow the great Tao, we must be compassionate and charitable, oppose that which corrupts, and tend to that which is weak and helpless, to do good as we encounter those in need, to make the world a kinder place as we make our way through it. Songlan nodded in agreement, and Xu Yang was magnanimous enough to at least refrain from open mockery, though his lips twisted automatically into contempt. But it's not enough, is it? Said Xiao Xingjin, frowning slightly. It's not enough to just haphazardly assist those we happen to stumble across, then claim we've made a difference. That's just self-righteous, selfish. It makes us feel better about what we've done, but it doesn't change anything. They both stared at him, and he raised his head as though he could look back at them, a shadow of frustration just where his brow hid under his blindfold. You told me that once, he said, and Xu Yang found himself locked in that eyeless gaze, shocked momentarily wordless. You said the people you hate the most are those who claim to be righteous, virtuous, Naive idiots who pretend they make the world better by doing a few good deeds. People like me, I guess. Shao Xingzhen, he finally managed to get out, or an attempt at it, after a short and ugly battle against his too long clenched jaw. But Xiao Xingzhen shook his head sharply, frowning deeper. You weren't wrong. Xingzhen, Song Lan said, in what might technically be Xiao Xingzhen's name, but carried all the tone of, what the fuck? I have thought about it for a long time. I can't stop thinking about it. I tried to think about it when helping that girl in Tanzhou to do something more. That's why I suggested an apprenticeship, to make a difference that actually mattered, and not just hand over a pouch of money. Feeling pleased with myself for solving a problem one day that would be back the next. But it's still not enough. Wait, Xu said, still reeling from the whiplash of emotions, torn out of one brooding subject and tossed headfirst into another. Xiao Xingzhen, wait, are you actually… No, listen, that day, it wasn't some grand… I was just trying to make you angry. The ghost of a conversation from over 7 years ago that he really, really didn't want replaying in his head. Not now, not here, not following that memory over and over to its soul-shattering conclusion. No, you weren't, Xiao Xingzhen said, and Xu Yang's only small comfort was the still bewildered look on Song Lan's face, unceremoniously dropped out of the conversation several awful sentences ago. You were angry, and those words were maybe the truest you said to me that day. He couldn't speak, crushed between the rock of remembering the last vicious words he'd thrown in Xiao Xingzhen's face, and the hard place of merciless Kuizhou, a city with teeth, gobbling up those stupid enough to be weak, to spit out their shattered finger bones. I'm trying to understand, Song Lan said, slowly, and it may be the first time in his life he was relieved at the coolly overbearing Dao Shi interrupting, steering a conversation between him and Xiao Xingzhen off its current track. What is it you want to do? Xiao Xingzhen made a face somewhere between helplessness and dismay, one hand making an almost involuntary gesture. I don't know. He shook his head, then tilted it up as though asking them for suggestions. I don't know, but I want to do something more. I need to do something more. I have been given the second chance at life to atone for the things I've done. Maybe we all have. I want to be able to tell children like the one in the street today that I do believe that the world can be kind. I want to make it kind for them. Xiang stared at him, his open, candid face, and the mocking laughter at the back of his throat felt alarmingly like something else entirely, and he bit it back. Xiao Xingzhen, he said, and despite his best efforts at disdain, his voice came out choked so gentle he could only pray Kuizhou wasn't listening. You can't change how the world works. This isn't some heavenly mountain hidden in the clouds. It's the real world. It's cruel and vicious and eats the weak. That's what the world is. Xiao Xingzhen scowled at him, so stern and unyielding he almost shied back. I chose the world. I gave up everything to live in it, learn its ways, make it better. You don't get to tell me that I don't know how cruel the world can be. And yes, that hurt, made his stomach clench hard under Shuanghua's scar. Xiao Xingzhen shook his head, turning his blind gaze half away, distant and thoughtful. I know it's not easy to make real change. Maybe it's not even possible. But does that mean I should just accept that things are the way they are? Cruel and vicious, as you say? What else would I do with my life here, if not following my own purpose? Even Song Lan looked like he was struggling with what to say, and not only because of the talisman coin still rattling loose in his dead mouth. Need to get that silver thread, Xu dazedly made a mental note of, and then promptly forgot. I agree with you. Of course I do. But the way is to act according to the here and now, not build lofty distant goals. All great things have their origins in that which is small, and that simple compassion, that seed in the empty ground is what we are, what we always have been. What else is it you want to do? Xiao Xingzhen gave an odd, quirky smile. Change is inevitable, the natural state of the universe. Why couldn't it be a change for the better? The teachings never say not to be that change, direct it. The yielding touch of waters blunts even the most jagged rock. We can carve channels. Something very nearly resembling a fond smile shifted Songlan's haughty, frost-cold face for a moment, and then vanished, replaced by efficiency. I'm not disagreeing with you, but we have little but our determination. Where should we start? We can stay here if you want, pick our old dream up again, take on those children as disciples. Is that what you want? Stay here, Xiang heard, the world gone pitch black and ice cold like death, his throat clenching shut. Xiao Xingzhen, staying forever in Kuizhou, the one thing he couldn't be without, in the one place he couldn't be. He was distantly aware that Xiao Xingzhen looked up in surprise, smiling, the faintest flush on his face. I thought you had forgotten. No, Xu thought, and fucked the pretentious tea house for serving overpriced food that was so clearly rotten, trying to crawl its way back up his guts like something week-old scraped out of a back-alley trash heap. There are 1,000 reasons you can't stay here, and I'll tell you each and every one as soon as I think the lie's up. You can't. I don't want you to. It was my dream too, Songlan said, that ugly, unbearable, almost smile on his face again, the sound of it echoing clear through the talisman, making Xiao Xingzhen's smile even warmer. It still is. There are countless temples and several sects based in this town already, Xu sneered, and the universe spared its last whiff of mercy on making his voice steady and unaffected. But of course, yours would make all the difference. You'll take on several dozen disciples, no doubt, making a real dent. I'm dying to hear how you'll choose the ones whose life you'll save. The brightest? The weakest? A game of chance, perhaps? You always were lucky drawing straws, Xiao Xingzhen. Whatever moment the two Dao Shi had been sharing was thankfully shattered, and they both turned to him, one hesitant, one furious. He laughed, ignoring the desperate edge to it. Let it sound like madness, all the better. You can sit on your doorstep and toss crumbs to the unfortunate ones, like all those other good-hearted monks. Those already strong enough to fight and steal will lounge around, gaping for a free meal, and those too weak to challenge them will still starve out of sight. But you'll stack up your 3,000 good deeds in no time, achieving saintly immortality and feeling so very pleased with yourselves. Xiao Xingzhen's brief look of uncertainty at his interruption had vanished, replaced by something he couldn't interpret until he spoke, and once he did, he swore internally. I'm happy that you're getting so invested. I would love to hear your constructive suggestions. A fucking challenge, the bastard. What? Petitioning the city officials to leave more warm dung heaps around in winter? More unlocked garden sheds? Things like that? Warm, safe shelters, Xiao Xingzhen calmly nodded, as though the taunts had been in any way meant as contributions, and he hissed at him. That's a good point. Safe places for those who have nowhere to go. Places to rest, eat, recover. Perhaps offering medical and spiritual care. Why not have them built out of jade and gold while you're at it? Xuan growled. Jade and gold palaces of luxury for the destitute in every last city of the empire. Unforgivably, Xiao Xingzhen's lips twitched, amused. Something like that. Shelters at least. The jade and gold may have to wait. Song Lan shot him a look that was exasperated, but surprisingly not entirely disagreeing, before turning back to Xiao Xingzhen, forehead furrowed. An undertaking like that, it would demand vast amounts of resources, administration, political authority. It's a noble goal, but I'm not sure I can see how we could make it a reality. Xiao Xingzhen frowned slightly, holding a sweeping sleeve aside to pick up his teacup again, to sip the forgotten lukewarm liquid. I know. Perhaps we can write petitions, like Xiang said, letters asking for support. People like Wang Daifu and Wu Daifu still remembered us, the legends of us. Maybe we could use that reputation, that standing, to gain influence enough to get started. Xiang wanted very much to point out that he'd been sarcastic, and that appeals for charity written to the mighty could just as well be delivered straight to the nearest trash heap, saving it the detour past some inflated official's table on its inevitable way there. But some small thought had begun gnawing at the back of his mind, no matter how he stabbed at it to keep it down. The great sects are jealous and quarrelsome, Song Lan pointed out, almost making sense for once. Disinterested in helping anyone out of charity, but all too glad to go on the offensive if they feel attacked or slighted. There was a reason we wanted to remain free of them. Getting involved in their business is dangerous. The rich and powerful want people humble and suffering, Xiang said, almost automatically, distracted. Stepping on others is how they became rich and powerful, and how they stay that way. He could see pieces locking together in his mind, like cogs and wheels clicking into place in a spirit compass, the brush strokes of a talisman aligning and blazing alive, like watching the tallest tree in a thunderstorm and knowing where lightning would strike next. Xiao Xingjin hung his head at the lack of support, unacceptable dejection on his face. There were 1,000, 100,000 reasons why it was the worst idea imaginable, a risk far too great, a course of action lined with endless potential for disaster. There has to be something we can do, Xiao Xingjin said, defeated. And that really sealed their fate, didn't it? As simple as that, because there was. Fuck, Xiang said, heartfelt, and committed. I have a friend, Xiang said, face gone serious, dark eyes flashing as though he wanted to bite the words bloody on their way out of his mouth. Who could make that stupid, ridiculous dream of yours a reality? Song Lan stared at the delinquent, Xingjin raising his head sharply in surprise at his side. What? Xiang's lips twitched habitually, smile-like, but there was no amusement whatsoever in his eyes. You want to change the world? You have to know who holds it in his hand. Bypass the quarreling sects and clans. Appeal to the highest power. And oh, would he love this. He'd eat it right up. A charity scheme proposed by the legendary Bright Moon and Gentle Breeze, the snow something, whatever it is you are. An excuse to magnanimously reach out and soothe the suffering of the poor and needy? Fuck, he'd get off on it. Like his glorified Watchtower project, but even more sickeningly altruistic. The chief cultivator? Song Lan asked, the erratically tossed around pieces finally snapping together in his mind. Yeah, Xiang said, reaching to take a swig of his tea only to seemingly realize his cup was long since empty, settled for spinning it round and round his fingertip against the table instead, unconsciously restless. Lian Fangjun, Jin Zongjue, Jin Gongyao, old friend of mine. The same Lian Fangjun who keeps heads for souvenirs? Song Lan found himself asking sharply, because he hadn't connected those particular pieces. Chief cultivator and Xiang's talented friend. At the time, that day in Yi City. Understandable, it had been a very overwhelming day, but it was still a disturbing insight. Xiang laughed, but again there was no amusement in it. Yes, that's the one. Oh fuck, that means I'll have to write him and say sorry for ratting him out, doesn't it? A very, very pretty letter with lots and lots of pretty apologies. That man nurses grudges more lovingly than anyone I know, myself included. And you say that this person, you think he would help us? Xingjin interjected weakly. I'm not saying it's a good idea, Xiang said, flatly, and for the first time he could remember, Song Lan briefly agreed with him. But the nasty part is it would probably work. He loves to feel needed, loves to feel that he's helping those most unfortunate in the world, basking in their grateful adoration. And you said it yourself, you are legends. For you to reach out and suggest a joint project like that, especially now that righteous Han Guanjun found out about his dirty little secret in Yi City. He sighed, rubbing one-handed at his eyes in annoyance. Story writes itself, doesn't it? His chance at distracting people from those nasty accusations with the grand act of gracious benevolence. You're one big shot at making that change you want. It could just work. Sung Lan stared at the demonic cultivator, searching the ruddy face for signs of betrayal and ulterior schemes, while knowing perfectly well that a master manipulator like Xu Yang would never let anyone see anything but what he wanted them to see. Apparently, what he wanted them to see now was jittery frustration, which was admittedly odd. "It sounds like a great risk," he said, warningly, glancing at Xingjin, whose face was forward in deep thought. "You said you killed Ji Fengjun together," Xingjin said haltingly. "Didn't you? That headless body hidden underneath that place was our home." The last aside sounded entirely involuntary, suddenly sharply offended, and Xiang actually flinched back, opened his mouth as to say something, but Xingjin shook his head in annoyance as to clear it. Plunging ahead, almost visibly forcing himself to focus on the goal at hand, no doubt trying to justify unsavory means with worthwhile ends. "If the chief cultivator stands accused of murder, how would he be able to help us?" he finally said, voice tight. "Why would he want to?" "No, see, that's why he will," Xiang argued, and unfortunately Song Lan knew that made a lot of sense. That's exactly what politics were, and the reason he had never been able to stomach the games of the great sects in the first place. It'll run right off him like water off a goose. Everything always does. And once the air is cleared and some poor asshole somewhere has taken the blame and the fall, Lian Fangjun will surely be the very dearest friend to anyone who stood by his side in these trying times. Perfect, isn't it? There was a long while of silence as they thought it all over, only broken by the grating noise of the small thimble teacup twirling against the table again, round and round and round. "You think it would work?" Xington said finally, quietly, as though asking something crucial of someone trusted, expecting honesty. "Yes," said Xu Yang back, reluctantly, rolling his eyes but sounding just as serious. "It is a great risk, maybe too great. I can't make any guarantees. He's a friend of sorts, but he still has the power to snuff us all out at a whim should he feel like it, for whatever reason. But if he agrees, yes, I think it will work. I wouldn't have suggested it otherwise." Song Lan very much wanted to intervene, protest, remind Xingjin of why they had so adamantly chosen to stay out of the clan's politics a long time ago. But with it all lined up like this, it did sound like a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Once in 2 lifetimes, he supposed. An opportunity to make something worthwhile come out of all their suffering, forcing the powers of corruption to assist in planting seeds of good for once. After another long silence of deliberation, Xingjin finally nodded, his face setting in those 2 familiar lines of determination, and Song Lan knew then with hopeless resignation and equally helpless affection that nothing would be able to change his mind now. "Then we will try." "We'll need to write letters," Xiang said, looking vaguely pained. "The most flowery, sycophantic letters imaginable. Heap on the titles in inflated flattery, sketch up your ideas in grand terms of sentimental charity. If we send message fast-track down the river, they'll reach Jinlingtai well in time for the big cultivation conference in a couple weeks. The perfect time for a scheme like this to be presented to the dazzled cultivator world, making them think of anything else but murder. And once it is, he can't well back out." Xingtin nodded. "Zijin, will you please do the writing? I haven't practiced my calligraphy in a long time." He very nearly automatically answered that he was sure it would be fine either way, before he caught the joke, and then only because Xu Yang finally gave an undignified snort of genuine laughter, losing his grip enough to send the spinning teacup clattering to the floor. When the waiters hurried over to clean up the shards, Xingtin apologized and blessed them with his most resplendent smile, asked for ink and paper and another pot of tea. One pot of tea eventually turned into many, daylight fading and lanterns and candles being lit all around to chase the shadows away, the room increasingly devoid of other guests. The combined pile of notes, roughly sketched maps, and discarded first drafts of letters grew steadily, until it avalanched off the table and onto the surrounding floor. At one point, in between arguing that medical care for those too poor to see a doctor was a non-negotiable part of his vision, and looking childishly sullen because both of them informed him that the people in power wouldn't care just because they should, and that offering up solid materialistic benefits would be necessary to sell in the concept, Xingjin asked the staff to have a room prepared for them for the night. At this rate, they clearly weren't going anywhere anytime soon. Bestowing the occasional scathing but annoyingly well-informed contribution, Xu was committing left-handed writing again, the painstakingly drawn characters still looking more like the scribbles of an untaught child than anything fit for the peony court. Presumably drafting his own private letter to the hopefully-to-be benefactor. Sung Lan mentally concluded with fierce determination that they wouldn't let him send anything to anyone without thoroughly checking it for signs of filthiest betrayal first. But Xingjin was smiling, absolutely radiant, more excited than he had seen him since before Baishu and the Celestial Mountain, before all the long years of pain. Come alive, gesturing and talking fast, chasing one thought at the trail of another, like they had under starlight nights so long ago, building a dream together. Sung Lan felt his heart sting with regret and dangerous reawakened hope and love, more than anything else, that. Disturbingly, he knew that if he glanced up now, he would see that far too familiar look, a dark cracked mirror of those same feelings, echoed on Xu face, and so resolutely kept his eyes on the piece of paper in front of him. I think this covers everything. We can go over it a few more times, but filling a bowl past the brim only makes it spill. Let me see that, the cutthroat killer across the table said, and snatched the letter up to read it. Only slightly raising a scalding eyebrow at him, Sung Lan calmly claimed his private letter in return, to scan it for horrible schemes of murder. He was almost disappointed when it appeared to be just the saccharine apologetic letter of blame-deflecting that Xu had claimed to write. "Well?" Xingjin asked eagerly. "Looks good enough," Xu said, eyes darting back and forth over the text. Yao is so very clever, he won't need any long-winded drivel to help connect the dots. Flattery in titles enough to act as bait, useful potential enough to set the hook. He'll figure out 36 ways to use this the moment he opens it. What he chooses to do with it is another thing. He lowered the letter and narrowed his eyes, while Song Lan still felt too deeply disturbed by the Yao to offer any commentary. Actually, you know what? We should definitely send a copy off to Guzu as well. The Lans are so very righteous, they would be delighted to be a part of this. Tojun is a friend of the chief cultivators too. He'll be so happy to learn you're alive and well and working with Li and Fangjun towards such a noble goal. He would be a great ally. Song Lan could tell there was a deeper meaning to the words, but couldn't decipher what. Just watched in vague frustration as Xu took his ugly, shaky handwriting to his own perfect calligraphy, striking out certain characters and adding a few others. There, good to go. Write it up nice and clean again, will you? Xingjin's smile widened even more, however, something almost childish about his sheer enthusiasm and delight. I'll go get us some more tea while you finish, he said, rising gracefully. They both automatically smiled after him, but the moment he was out of earshot, Xu instantly stopped smiling and leaned in, far too close for comfort. Whatever happens after this, never trust Jin Guangyao around him, he said, voice low and grim, acerbic like smoke. Given half a chance, he'll thread his neck and hands with strings and dance him like a puppet. Sung Lan narrowed his eyes, forced himself not to back down or flinch. You said he was a friend. Xu didn't even smile, just held his gaze, uncomfortably raw. Friend is a loose term. He's a politician. He uses people, and he would absolutely love to use him. You know how Xiao Xingjin is. He'll offer himself up to be taken advantage of in a heartbeat if he thinks it will help people. Dance to destruction. Like you did? He couldn't hold back the damning bitterness, and the smile instantly slid back on Xu face, a shield of deceit over what he belatedly realized had been honesty. Yes, you wouldn't let that happen again, will you, Song Daojang? You already abandoned him once. Don't let the evils of the world destroy him again while you keep your sulking back turned. That hurt, and was also true, and he did finally recoil under the guise of straightening to give a cold look down his nose, just to be able to put some distance between himself and the vile creature. Xu just smiled knowingly up at him, every bit as bitter. I think we have all earned this, Xingjin said, breaking the moment, laughter on his voice as he came sweeping back to their table with a large plate in his hands. Song Lan only caught what happened to Xu because he was still looking so closely at him. The stab of absolute shock and revulsion and something very, very close to horror flashing across his face. Then he shot to his feet with a feral snarl, his features twisted into a mask of fury, loudly knocking another wave of loose papers off the table and to the floor. "Do you think this is funny?" he hissed, something so demonic that Xingjin stumbled a stunned step back, almost dropping the plate of assorted pastries he was carrying. "Trying to patch every wrong in the world up tonight? Tossing treats to your faithful dog?" They were all frozen for a moment, Song Lan too startled to move, Xingjin looking as though he had been physically slapped, Xu literally snarling. Then he whipped around on his heel and stormed off, growling, in the direction of the room they had been assigned. Xingjin slowly sank to his knees by the table, as though all air had been knocked out of him, groping blindly for an empty enough surface to deposit the plate from his unsteady hands. Song Lan quickly took it away and set it aside, caught one of those shaking hands in his own. "Are you all right?" "Did I do something wrong?" Xingjin asked, voice thin, still clearly reeling. After leaving his resentment to rest all evening, suspiciously but pleasantly surprised at Xu brief foray into manners almost bearable, Song Lan was back to concluding that, no, actually the man really needed a sword to the guts. "You didn't. He's clearly been itching for a fight all day. I suppose the delinquent of Guizhou isn't all that comfortable back on old home turf." Xingjin just stared at him, wordless, so stunned he couldn't help but wonder if he had done something wrong. "Guizhou? Xu is from Guizhou. I had forgotten. Cheng Mei wasn't..." His shocked expression shifted into one of remorseful dismay. Oh no, I think I may have done something horribly cruel." Only silence answered when Xiao Xingjin knocked on the door, and for a dreadful moment he worried that Xu had left, really left, gone to take his murderous venom out on anything alive on the streets of Guizhou. He knocked again, then opened the door, suddenly desperately having to make sure. "Xu?" Still only silence, but he could make out harsh breathing, furious and uneven. He took a few hesitant steps into the room, relieved that Xu was here, replaced by apprehension that Xu was, in fact, here, having to be dealt with. "Are you all right?" he asked. Cheng Mei had never been good with apologies, never willingly given, graceless at receiving. But he was good at grudges, and he didn't want that, not now, not when they had come so close to... He wasn't sure what. Sharing something, a familiar companionship, impossibly, woven between all three of them for a few hours while the world looked away. Still only silence answered him. "I'm sorry," he said, because he was. "I was thoughtless. I didn't mean to hurt you." There was a bitter laugh at that almost had him recoiling, but underneath the viciousness it sounded profoundly unhappy. Street fleas, dirt under people's shoes, children and their fingers so expendable. "Xu," he tried again, softly, but was cut off by a throaty snarl. "Don't." Another few rugged breaths. Don't talk to me right now. I will hurt you if you do, and I don't want that. Then I won't, he said, strangely relieved because this was honestly improvement. He took a step back. We can talk later. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. Only silence again. I'll go down and help finish things up. It will probably take a while. We'll try not to disturb you if you're asleep when we come back. Is there anything you need? For you to leave. A quiet hiss, and stupidly it made him have to fight back an unforgivable smile. The response so predictable it made his heart twinge. Not wholly a stranger after all, no matter how much he sometimes wanted to think so. He nodded instead and stepped back outside, ready to close the door. About today, what you offered, what we've all started building together, it means everything to me. Thank you. There was a hit to the suddenly shaky breathing, something terrifyingly fragile. He closed the door then, knowing all too well how easily any glimpsed weakness would slide into threats and violence with this man. Leaning his forehead against the door for a dizzy moment, he decided that surely, after today he was allowed the sting of grieving affection in his heart, despite everything. Good night, Xuyang, he breathed and turned to leave, wanting to make the world a kinder place for the sake of that once broken child, too. Blooper. Sometimes the rot of a putrefied avalanched. Sunglan briefly agreed with him. There was a non-negotiable where was I?